And again, it's a pleasure to join the class. I'll share a few kind of things that I'm kind of preoccupied right now. I'll share maybe a little bit of my work in my office, as well as what I do in studio at school. As Lina mentioned, I very recently I was teaching in Rome, and to me, being in Italy, working in Italy, has been extremely inspiring, and I hope to return again as soon as this September to continue that course of study for another year. I'm originally from Bulgaria, which is just a couple of hours to the east of you. And my grandfather actually studied at the University of Bologna. I've again, I have a kind of a really strong sentiment about Italians and about Italy in general. So let me again. I haven't used Microsoft Teams. If I can share my screen successfully, hold on.
Yeah, there is a button in the height close to Abbandona, with the arrow. Okay.
Can you? And I assume you can see my screen now.
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay, very good. So to kind of expand a little bit on the again, the wonderful introduction that I got from Lina. So I'm a practicing architect, and I teach at Cornell. I work on various projects around the world. But I started my career actually in fashion design. When I came to the US, and after studying fashion design, I studied interior design, and then went to study actually at Cornell as an architect. And all along, really drawing has been the kind of the common thread in my practice. And I practice by drawing, and I teach drawing, and to me, the ability to articulate tectonic ideas or formal ideas or spatial ideas or conceptual ideas through drawing is extremely important, and I believe it's a kind of an extremely important skill for the architect. Not so much to be able to visualize a finished product, to articulate a vision, but rather to find, to inquire, to investigate, to discover, to make mistakes, to change one's mind. The drawing itself, kind of understood as a line of inquiry, to me is a kind of it's the language really of the architect. So the drawing or the sketch, again, in this notion of the unfinished or the non-finito, which I absolutely love as a theme that Lina has set up for her lab and the series of lectures and workshops. The non-finito, the idea of the open outcome, the open outcome of the sketch of the drawing, is a kind of a really powerful way to investigate architecture and to create architecture. To quote Robin Evans, who's obviously a kind of a notable theorist and thinker in the realm of architecture. The architect never really works directly on the object of their thought, and they always work through this intervening medium, which is the drawing. So the drawing, to me, is in fact architecture. In Italy, probably more so than the United States, where crafts and making is so important, and architecture, I feel, in design is embedded in kind of in every stone, every threshold, every door frame, every windowsill, in the way kind of architecture exists in Italy. Again, it's stronger in this kind of fast mass-produced architecture in the U.S. And I really value that kind of dedication to making. And I in my practice, in the way I teach, I want to acknowledge that fact that one can discuss design and make at the same time. And I'm here quoting Mario Carpo. So to draw and to make, to me, is a kind of a symbiotic process, and that develops by again continuously understanding the drawing as architecture, understanding the drawing is a physical artifact, not just representation, not just a kind of visualization and expression of a vision, but rather something that it's made with one's hand, something that kind of depicts the nature of the graphite or the ink and the texture and the weight of the paper, and how a mark is made onto the paper, and how, again, kind of a design is extracted from the blank surface of the paper. And here again, in direct reference to unfinished or non finito, as Lina has set up the theme, how we discover ideas, whether it's your amazing compatriot Michelangelo, how he discovers form and really life from within a piece of stone, or how you might search for form and search for space within the blank piece of paper. To me, it's a really, really powerful creative process. And that goes back many, many years ago, many centuries indeed. This is probably one of the very first, or at least the kind of the earliest recorded drawings. This is a cave painting over 17,000 years ago in France. And you have to agree with me, that's a really sophisticated kind of a drawing. We have these notions here of foreground and midground and background. We have the notions of line and tone, the notion of scale, the really sophisticated idea of transparency, almost kind of an X-ray vision through a drawing. And again, this was done centuries and centuries ago through the kind of the human remarkable ability to abstract reality and to actually put it on the kind of this abstract two-dimensional surface, and within the two-dimensional surface to be able to create space and depth and a world that is imagined. So again, to me, before architecture even exists, before a building happens, the drawing itself is an incredibly rich world, an incredibly rich universe within which ideas exist, and they're malleable, and they're continuously transforming. They're unfinished in the best sense of the word. They're open to multiple possibilities and an infinite amount of various futures. So that's why in my own studio courses and in the seminars that I teach, I really emphasize the idea again that drawing is already architecture. Sketch in particular, and again, this is the drawing that allows us to change our mind, the drawing that allows us to draw a line multiple times, to erase, to correct, to contradict ourselves, is an incredibly powerful creative tool. The sketch itself is perhaps the past software, past kind of parametric and algorithmic design, the intuitive meandering of thought on paper is probably as powerful as the creative process can possibly get. So the sketch, again, I'm treating as not just as an image, not just as a projection, but as a real artifact itself, something that has weight. In this particular sketch, I'm calling here the lead cloud. So clearly something that is created by lead, which itself is an extremely heavy material, but a drawing that not just this one, but any drawing, any sketch has the ability, unlike architecture or a building, to defy gravity. And in that particular space where possibilities are infinite and gravity doesn't exist, the sketch again is a kind of a really powerful way to create. The sketch, the drawing, is a physical artifact. I really see as an aspiration towards architecture, something that can be amplified, something that can aspire to be built form, to be a structure, to be form, and to be space. In my own practice, again, I develop projects mostly through kind of series of these drawings. This is a kind of a recent sketch of a house that I'm designing in Karachi, and I'll speak about it a little bit more as we go along. But this is I don't know if any of you have been in Karachi, but it's a really complex metropolis, and kind of an environment that is kind of like somewhat hostile. And the program here was to create almost a fortified dwelling that had a facade that was impenetrable from the outside, yet allowed the light to come through. So this filigree, this development of the facade here was actually developed literally through the kind of the motion of erasure. This is a sketch of a much larger project. This is a border station, a kind of a land port of entry between the US and Canada. It's one of those bridges that actually you have in Italy over the highway. So this is again a port of entry and a $100 million project that was, and again I'll tell you a little bit more about it later on, but it was won through a competition, like an anonymous competition through this single sketch. And I'll tell you the story a little bit later. Not much different than this professional sketch. I'm sharing here something that I found in a sketchbook from when I was a student in second year, first year. So at about the same level in education where you are at the University of Pisa. And this drawing kind of really spoke to me, although I didn't necessarily know what I was doing at the time. But to me, it was a kind of an interesting sketch that is searching for the form, the expression of the facade. This is a small library project in Soho in New York. And it also is trying to carve spaces out of this wireframe of kind of structural logic that the drawing is beginning to establish. Some early sketches of mine. This is a house in Bulgaria, and this is when I discovered Photoshop. And obviously, you're much better versed, I suppose, in software. But this is when I began to combine my sketchbooks, my sketches, my hand drawings, with the ability to bring in references to kind of the environment, the context, the reality. A sketch here for my project in Mumbai. I have some plans that I will show you of this project, but it's a kind of a massive penthouse off Marine Drive in Mumbai that was kind of a really kind of large floor plate. And the design challenge in this case was to actually bring light in the center of the space. And this was an idea that came to me as I was traveling from New York to Mumbai via Zurich. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Zurich airport, but it's like one of my favorite buildings in kind of in its simplicity. And in the terminal, I discovered kind of a series of light wells, a series of kind of translucent glass courtyards that brought light in the middle of the terminal. And as I took the second flight from Zurich to Mumbai, I actually sketched my idea for the core space of the residence. And through a picture that I took with my phone, I incorporated that sense of light, the translucency of the material, and the animated movement of the plants that were encased in the courtyard. I managed to merge that into the sketch, basically with simple Photoshop software that was on my phone. And as soon as I landed in Mumbai, I had that drawing, I had that idea ready to present. But the point that I'm making here, although this is quite rudimentary, kind of in terms of using software and technology, mostly what I want to point out is a kind of this ability or this willingness, really, to be always on the lookout and to be always aware of one's environment, of one's context, to be impressionable by even the most mundane of things. And again, through developing our own ability to record that, to capture the environment, to capture the surroundings, and to put it on paper. So to record it and then to project how it might be reappropriated, how it might be reimagined into a project is a skill that should be independent from technology. It should be independent from software, and it should be something that kind of an author or an architect really kind of owns, kind of within their own kind of most basic, most direct ability to speak or to express ourselves. Now, I try to I try to empower my own students again with this idea, this notion of the sketch, not just as a drawing, but also the idea of the sketch model. And the sketch model, the way I think about it, again, is the ability to meander, the ability to inquire, the ability to build without necessarily knowing immediately where one is going, but rather to develop, to cultivate intuition. And I know this is probably contradictory if you accept the notion that intuition is again a kind of a venture into the unknown, and the notion of being cultivated is the idea of premeditation. But to me, in the model, and again, the space between drawing and building, or drawing and making, to me, the model, and particularly the study, the etude, the non finito, the sketch model is a space where, again, the architect's drawing begins to aspire to be structure and to be form and to be space. And I will speak about these models. These are student models from my first year architecture students. And I'll tell you again a little bit more about those. Back to this idea of the sketch and practice. This is a project of mine of a house on Long Island in New York City, or in New York. It's about 3 hours from New York City. And this is again a project that is now about 20 years old. And it was my very first house. At the time, I was an associate in an architecture firm in Soho, Smith Miller Hawkinson. And we had just received this commission in the office. And my boss at the time, Henry Smith Miller, was a kind of a busy architect, busy professor. He was a professor at the Parsons School in New York City. And he was in reality kind of like too busy to take on this house, this project. So on his way out of the office, he looked at me and at a friend and a colleague of mine who was sitting next to me, and he said, "Okay, I'll be back in 3 hours." And I want to see each one of you develop an idea for this house that was just commissioned. And whichever idea I like, that's the house that we're going to build, and that's the person who's going to get the project. So it was this kind of adrenaline rush for both me and my friends who had just started working there. He's quite talented fellow who had just graduated from Princeton. So he dove into AutoCAD and Illustrator, and he started making these diagrams. And I myself kind of started sketching on this one single piece of paper to articulate the concept for this villa, which, as you can see on the sketch, had a kind of 3 volumes that defined a courtyard, and the upper volume that kind of hovers above the ground plane was the private quarters. This is where all the bedrooms were, and that was sitting kind of on a freestanding wall, and a lower volume that contained all the living spaces, the living room, the kitchen, the dining room, and that was completed by a 3rd volume, which was the swimming pool, again defining a courtyard or kind of tamed piece of nature that really became the core of the house. And it was such a clear, simple idea, again, embedded in the power of a kind of a single drawing, a single diagram, a single sketch, that kind of naturally became the concept of the house, and became the house that I ended up building in the following 2 years. So this is the villa from the outside, with a kind of a fairly opaque shell that kind of provides kind of privacy and security from the view from the outside, and that same house being open on the inside with a much softer facade, a lot more transparent, towards, again, an inner courtyard where all the spaces, the public and the private spaces, opened up. But again, I attribute me getting the commission, getting the kind of the assignment to design the house based on the clarity of a single drawing. This is the $100 million project that I mentioned. This is the this big border station, which again, a competition that was an anonymous competition that was won by a single sketch. So in this case, the client was actually the US government, and they had selected 6 firms that were invited to participate. None of us were told what the project was going to be, and we were each brought to a hotel in downtown Manhattan, and we each got a hotel suite, and we were given 8 hours to develop a scheme for this project. Very interestingly, none of us were given any computers. All we had was paper and pencils and a calculator, and access to the hotel business center. And the hotel business center at the time only had a Xerox machine. So we each had to develop a scheme in 8 hours, and then present it anonymously through kind of the series of drawings that we could produce in 8 hours. And based on that, the commission was awarded. So again, we were a group of 3 people from my office, and we had somebody kind of trying to establish the program, somebody trying to orchestrate the roads and the geometry of the highway, and how kind of, again, a border station that none of us knew much about. So as the team tried to kind of develop the logistics, I was trying to kind of imagine, again, a building that was a gateway or a bridge or kind of a kind of, you know, this architecturalized threshold really between two countries, between two nations. But to convey the scale of it, to convey the again, the kind of the presence of that building on the site, I took a little sketch, basically what you're looking at on the screen, and I took it to the Xerox machine or the photocopier, and I amplified that drawing by 400%, which was the maximum amplification on the Xerox machine. And then I took that and I amplified it again 400%, and that obviously started like coming out of the machine on multiple pieces of paper. And I would take each piece of paper and I would multiply it again by 400% until I had 100 pieces of paper that were each kind of a segment of the stroke of the pencil. And I took like some tape, you know, some Scotch tape, and I put all the pieces together, and that became a kind of a 12-foot drawing that, again, as a drawing was beginning to aspire to become a building. And that aspiration, that vision, that, again, ambition of the drawing to become architecture is what I believe captured the kind of the attention of the jury, and eventually, not eventually, but immediately that night, we got the commission. So these are some much later on development drawings of how that one sketch became to be a building, and it sits now over a highway between the US and Canada. Back to that project in Mumbai, I'm not going to talk much about it, but again, this is the sketch that I did at the Zurich airport, or really it was on the airplane from Zurich to Mumbai. And at the end, because I had just started teaching in Ithaca, so I had left my kind of comfortable base in New York City, and I was working from a sketchbook, and I was working from my iPhone, which at the time I think it was iPhone 4 or something. A lot of the drawings, a lot of the direction, a lot of the documents that I was sending on to the craftsmen in Mumbai were literally sketches from my sketchbook. That was really kind of the most direct way to communicate what I wanted to have happen in this kind of really complex existing structure. So these are some snapshots of the space at the end, the light, the material. These are some snapshots from the kind of the few site visits that I had. Again, because I was working directly with the craftsmen, I was working directly with the builders, and I did not speak their language, and they did not speak my language. The drawing, or the lingua franca, that common language, became really the ultimate way that I could communicate directly and expressly what I imagined I wanted, and these extremely skillful, extremely knowledgeable craftsmen would be able to look at a drawing, would be able to look at a sketch, and implement that in teak wood and in stone, whatever the material was. So this was in essence my laptop on site. This is the carpenter who kind of would watch me flip through my sketchbook, build me a little impromptu stand for it. So anytime we had a discussion, that became the kind of the way for me to refer to the drawn instructions, and everything from the size of the door openings to the alignment of the marble slabs to the sizes of the kind of the various materials to the lighting. Everything was done through a series of freehand sketches while on site. A few other projects in here I'm just going to breeze through. This is these are a series of lofts in Manhattan, and in Manhattan, especially when you're starting out, kind of the loft project is kind of the bread and butter for young practices. So this was a project on the west side of Manhattan that was kind of obliterated by one of the hurricanes, Hurricane Sandy, that moved up from Florida on the coast, on the East Coast, and it completely flooded and destroyed this apartment. So this is a kind of a full renovation, restoration of that space. And again, I'm just sharing the kinds of drawings that I create as I try to capture the structure, the context, the light, the materiality, the furniture, the experiential sequences. These are not for the client. These are not for the builder. These are kinds of drawings that I build that I create for myself to be able to imagine what it would be like to occupy the space. And again, this is the kind of the iterative, the meandering sketch is a never completed, is a non-finito state of flux, in the ability of kind of the architect, in this case myself, to change my mind, to draw over, to erase, to shift, to manipulate, to alter. Of course, at the end, as these things get built, one needs precision, and I can't really say that I only draw by hand. Eventually, I do have to go to the precision of the digital drawing. But before these digital drawings become what they are, and before they are translated into kind of precise and kind of finite form, that state of flux to me is where creativity really occurs. These are some other spaces that I've created. This happens to be a project in San Francisco. This is back in New York. Sketching is a way of resolving technical details, technical issues, communicating again with craftsmen, with builders. And this is kind of a few slides that kind of bridge this idea of the analog sketch, the hand sketch, and the digital sketch. Again, these are drawings that are meant to be open-ended, that are meant to be unfinished until, of course, things are set in stone. Quickly, a few current projects. This is a house in San Francisco that I'm designing right now. These are the sketches of it. It's a house on 2 lots, so it's trying to break down the volumes so it fits in the neighborhood, and in the meantime, kind of create kind of a courtyard kind of a small piece, again, of tamed nature that is different from the garden that is outside of the house. This is a building in Ithaca, Cayuga Heights, that is coming up as we speak. And again, this is developed through a series of sketches that I'm sharing with you now, from kind of the construction details to the landscape, to the lighting, to the kinds of trees, the kind of space that I like to imagine. And again, these sketches, as much as they're spatial, as much as they're about the form of the architecture, they become truly working drawings where I start to resolve things as prosaic and mundane, but certainly important, as lighting, as air conditioning, as supplying hot air and returning the air, or supplying cooling, etc., to the spacing of the wood siding, the illumination of the ceiling, the grain of the plywood, the spacing of the bookshelves, the kind of furniture, the framing of the views, and the continuation of the landscape throughout the building. Again, done very, very quickly. These are not presentation drawings. They're not drawings to get the project or to convince the client. These are kinds of drawings to resolve architectonic and spatial dilemmas that I, as the architect, would have as I develop a project. And this is just this past winter, by the way, in Ithaca. It snowed as recently as 2 weeks ago. So these photographs aren't that old. But anyhow, these sketches now coming to form in wood framing. And this is the magnolia tree just outside of the house that recently bloomed. I'm going to breeze here because I know we don't have much time left. But this is a house that I mentioned in Karachi, which again, as most of my projects tend to do, is preoccupied with this idea of tamed nature or the courtyard. And the courtyard, I have to confess, is something that I discovered as a kind of powerful architectural space when I was a student in Italy. And I was a student in Rome in 1996, I think. And Lina, I don't know if you ever met Jeffrey Blanchard. He's the director of the Rome, the Cornell program in Rome, a historian of architecture, in particular Renaissance and Baroque architecture. So he would take us around Italy and kind of show us all these amazing buildings. And one of the buildings that really made an impression on me was this Farnese Palazzo in Caprarola, outside of Rome. And I remember I was kind of really impressed by kind of the configuration of this drawing and the kind of the courtyard, which is such a kind of typical part of the typology, you know, of the palazzo. But anyhow, what I wanted to mention here, and actually now it's coming to me. The day that we were in that building, and my professor Jeffrey Blanchard was really describing the frescoes that were on the ceiling in one of the main halls of the palazzo, and we were all looking up, and he was kind of describing the story that was depicted in the fresco. And I remember the kind of the image of the ceiling painting kind of coming to life, almost literally starting to move. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, this Professor Blanchard is such an amazing storyteller. The kind of the images are moving and coming to life, to very quickly realize that the building was literally moving. And this was in fact the 1996 earthquake at Assisi that was actually shaking the building, and we quickly had to run out. But that's how I would never ever forget my experience of the building. What I want to point out here, though, is the way the building is drawn, and by Vignola in particular, who one could argue is the inventor of the architect's construction sets. You know, the architect's construction drawings, the way the architect draws in terms of instructing the builder of how to make a building. So if architects draw like that in plan and section, and painters would draw the same building like that, and a photographer or a drone might depict it this way, the architect, the one who conceives of the plan and the section and the space simultaneously in this multivalent drawing, would draw a building in this way. And to me, that's a kind of a really, really powerful way to conflate the plan and the section in a single drawing. So I'm going to make a leap here on this idea of plan and section, the ability to see in X-ray, this ability, which is almost like a superpower, or one could argue the naivete of a child to be able to imagine things transparent, to be able to imagine that one could have, in fact, X-ray vision. And that's how I like to teach my students to think of architecture, not as objects, not as artifacts, but as these kind of conflated set of spatial conditions that one can imagine occupying. So you're probably kind of recognizing this drawing, obviously credited here to Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's an illustration from The Little Prince, the story that I'm sure most of you would have read. And it's a drawing that is described by the narrator of The Little Prince, the top drawing, a drawing that the narrator, shared with his adult relatives, and asking whether they were scared by the drawing, to which they replied that they were not, because why would they be scared by a hat? And the narrator, of course, being extremely offended because the drawing is not a hat at all, but rather a boa snake that had just had a small elephant for breakfast. So, in fact, a drawing that's quite more horrific than a hat. But the point that I'm making, again, is that children have this kind of amazing naivete, this amazing ability to see the world in a way that adults forget is possible. And that naivete, that leap, that intuitive search, and a kind of understanding of the environment in nature and how we conceive architecture is what I try to develop in my students in the way they draw, the way they model, the way they imagine their projects. And in that way, I try to develop in them, again, this cultivated intuition, or at the very least, what I call empathy, this ability to relate to the environment, to the ability to place ourselves in the context, and understand architecture, again, through kind of a series of kind of relationships that are centered about the notion of empathy. So for that reason, when I teach in first year, before students really start thinking about plans and sections and a structure and mechanical systems and details and envelopes and insulation and kind of all the kind of technicalities of architecture, I try to have them focus on the kind of the fundamentals, which are the human or the human body, and how we occupy the elements, the elemental, the kind of the basic components of architecture, and the elements of nature, namely air, water, earth, and fire. So usually I would start again from the point of perspective of the visceral experience of architecture, the visceral experience of space. I run my studio in a sequence of 2 semesters, where the second one focuses on the elements of architecture, the kind of the column, the beam, the window, the wall, these kind of rudimentary elements that establish the notion of shelter or enclosure. And before then, we spend a semester considering the elements of nature, as I mentioned already, the earth, air, water, and fire. So I have students actually draw these elements, not so much draw the elements, but study the elements by having the elements draw themselves. Like, how does air record itself on paper? How does fire or water draw themselves on earth? I take the students out of the classroom. I take them out of, this is Cornell University in whatever, probably late 1800s. And we have a bunch of dedicated architects over their drawing boards. And this is our studio right now. This is the round Koolhaas designed a studio plate, where kind of everybody works on their computers. But in the first 6 months, I really try to get the students out of the building. And again, through a series of exercises, students draw in a way that they never thought architecture is drawn. So I'm sharing here kind of a series of drawings, which again are the elements drawing themselves. One could already begin to see form and structure and logic and space in these drawings, which you would agree a first-year student who comes into this program would have never really considered that could be drawing of architecture. The second part of the exercise for me, and again, this is in this idea of the drawing aspiring to be architecture, I introduce this notion of translation. How do you take that drawing of the natural element drawing itself, and how do you translate that into something that could be understood as architecture? So in the course of study, I have the students actually design these machines, or these you might call kind of models, but in essence, kind of drawing machines that take the elemental drawings, that take the markings of the elements, and they amplify them into larger drawings. So an elemental drawing would be transcribed, would be translated through a machine, a drawing machine that the student designed, and is entirely activated by their own body. So again, they develop empathy, they develop a visceral, a physical codependency with the drawing. So the drawing is not just an idea, it's not a click on the keyboard, it's not a command, but it's something that is made with the entire body. And in the process, a small kind of drawing is taken and it's amplified, again, in the spirit of this aspiration of becoming something as large as a building and something as kind of spatial and structural and occupiable and really colossal as architecture. So in that process, kind of series of projects develop where kind of students begin to inhabit kind of these opportunistic moments that they discover by exploring nature, or very simply put, the kind of the elemental aspects of nature. So this is kind of first semester, first year projects that begin to embed themselves in kind of elemental landscapes. The second sequence of that course is about the elements of architecture. And again, here I'm basically referring to Gottfried Semper, who describes architecture in its four elements: the kind of the plinth that kind of elevates the human above the ground plane and shelters it, let's say, around, against floods and wild animals. The second element being the roof. So you've got the plinth, the roof, the enclosure or the wall, and most importantly, the hearth, all in the spirit of protecting the fire, which kind of gives warmth and allows the human to survive. So building up on these four elements per semper, the hearth, the mound, the wall, the roof, I'm now adding in the mix the door, the window, the skylight, the column,